Salutations everybody, it is Matty here today, and we're diving back into Dragon Age the Veilguard. I apologize I'm a few days late on this. I was a little under the weather this weekend, and so after just working my tail off for the last 2 months, I just wanted to take a little weekend away, get back to this news, start in the new week. So we're diving into Veilguard, which many of us were left with a lot of questions after we played the game, or even just saw it. But it was different from two prior BioWare releases in Anthem and Mass Effect Andromeda, where those games left question marks more about polish or the direction of the overall studio. Whereas Veilguard, for as bad as I think it was in a lot of areas, my questions really weren't about polish. It was more so, why are we doing this? How did things end up this way? Well, finally, we have a report shining some light on those answers. Now, some of this report does cover information I've extensively covered before. So out of respect for your time and my own, I'm going to give you just a very brief recap on what the Veilguard development cycle was like, because we've covered it extensively leading into the launch of the game, and much of this article is that. What I really want to get into with this conversation is what happened leading up to the launch and sort of the infighting between the Dragon Age team and the Mass Effect team. If you watch Mark Dara's YouTube channel, specifically the video about after Dragon Age launching and what happens next at BioWare, you'll know in that video that he highlighted how originally BioWare was a multi-team studio that had different projects going on at the same time, and over the years they gradually funneled their focus more and more, peeling other teams off of their projects to go focus on and help ship the next game in the pipeline. This happened with Andromeda, this happened with Anthem, and it also happened with Veilguard, leaving BioWare in a situation for the first time in their studio's history since their first ever game where they're working on just one title. There's a ton to get into onto how Veilguard plays into all of this, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But first, if you're new here and you're into what's going on with BioWare, we still talk about them whenever something new pops up with them. Consider subscribing. So just some quick history here. Basically, Dragon Age the Veilguard had been rebooted 3 separate times. It started off as a small project led up by Mark Dara and Mike Laidlaw. Then EA put in the order for, online live service games. That's where Anthem came from, but also the next Dragon Age game would be a live service game. Now, as documented here in this Bloomberg write-up, inside the Dragon Age debacle that gutted EA's BioWare studio, you'll see here it says former art director Matt Goldman replaced Laidlaw as creative director, and with a tiny team began pushing ahead on a new multiplayer version of Dragon Age codenamed Morrison, while everyone else helped finish Anthem, which was struggling to coalesce. Goldman pushed for a pulpy, more lighthearted tone than previous entries, which suited an online game, but was a drastic departure from the dark, dynamic stories that fans loved in the fantasy series. So, yeah, you were wondering about tone. This is where it started, when the game was supposed to be live service. As we'll get into in a moment, the game eventually got a third reboot in about 2020 to go back to a single-player direction. And despite having an asset pool to work with that amounts across many years of work, you're still changing the design and the direction of the video game 3 times over, and it is, I think, in this case, as you'll learn, a shared blame. I still think a lot of people are using this article to absolve BioWare of everything and restart that cycle that I have no doubt been part of, which is, oh, this is all EA's fault, the next game will be great. It's like BioWare still made a lot of questionable creative decisions here that were limited, though, by EA's mandate, and we'll talk about that in tandem. But let's keep reading the article together as we start to unpack what really happened here. So we're picking up in the middle of the story. It's the multiplayer version. What's going on with BioWare at that point in time? Jason writes, in the wake of BioWare's second consecutive flop, that being Anthem, the multiplayer version of Dragon Age continued to take shape. While the previous games in the franchise had featured tactical combat, this one would be all action. Instead of quests that players would only experience once, it would be full of missions that could be replayed repeatedly with friends and strangers. Important characters couldn't die because they had to persist for multiple characters across never-ending gameplay. As the game evolved over the next 2 years, the failure of Anthem hovered over the studio. Were they making the same mistakes? And some BioWare employees said that they were simply building Anthem with dragons. Then throughout 2020, the pandemic disrupted the game, and in December, Casey Hudson, the head of the studio, and Mark Dara, the head of the Dragon Age franchise, had both left. Shortly thereafter, Gary McKay, BioWare's new studio head, revealed another shift and that Dragon Age would no longer be multiplayer. And he said, we were thinking, does this make sense? Does this play into our strengths? Or is this going to be another challenge that we have to face? And the answer is no, we need to get back at what we're really good at. So at this point, you'll remember during the cycle of covering this game before it came out, hope was starting to get restored here. It was like, that's a great decision. Like, they're working on a single player game. They got away from the live server stuff. As we'll break down here, though, the roots of that multiplayer game tied down a lot of Dragon Age's mechanical potential. Keep that word in mind because it's not mentioned here, but it's the mechanical potential of, say, things like the choice and consequence. The creative decisions, though, say the tone, the writing, that is both a skill problem as well as just, I think, just questionable creative decision making that does fall to BioWare. But this does start with a lot of that live service vision. So let's keep going. Jason writes, in theory, the reversion back to Dragon Age's tried and true single-player format should have been welcome news inside BioWare, but there was a catch. Typically, this kind of pivot would be coupled with a reset and a period of pre-production allowing the designers to formulate a new vision for the game. Instead, the team was asked to change the game's fundamental structure and recast the entire story on the fly according to people familiar with the new marching orders. They were given a year and a half to finish and told to aim for as wide a market as possible. Kiss of death right there, by the way, that last sentence. But that year and a half to finish as well. Sounds familiar? It's the same spot Andromeda was in. It's the same spot Anthem was in. And it always comes down to a similar order of events. Usually EA wants something, BioWare wants something. They have this meeting in the middle moment, and then they're given a very short amount of time to see it through, and the game, and in turn BioWare's rep, suffers dramatically for it. However, this is not where the story ends because, as we know, Veilguard came out in 2024, so they got more time. Let's see what they did with that. This strict deadline became a recurring problem. The development team would make decisions believing they had less than a year to release the game, which severely limited the stories they could tell and the world they could build. Then the title would inevitably be delayed a few months, at which point they'd be stuck with those old decisions with no chance to stop and reevaluate what was working. At the end of 2022, amid continually dizzying leadership changes, the studio started distributing an alpha build of Dragon Age to get feedback internally and from outside playtesters. According to people familiar with the process, the reactions were concerning. The game's biggest problem, early players agreed, was a lack of satisfying choices and consequences. Previous BioWare titles had presented players with gut-wrenching decisions, which allies to save and factions to spare, enemies to slay. Such dilemmas made fans feel like they were shaping the narrative, historically a big draw for many BioWare games. But Dragon Age's multiplayer roots limited such choices, according to people familiar with the development. BioWare delayed the game's release again, while the team shoehorned in a few major decisions, such as one of 2 cities to save from a dragon attack. But because most of the parameters were already well established, the designers struggled to pair the newly retrofitted choices for players with meaningful consequences downstream. Yeah, I remember when I was reviewing this game and I saw that was the first time I had a little bit of hope while playing it because I wasn't really enjoying it much up until that point, and I saw that and how dramatically the cities can change, and I was excited about it, and some new quests popped up in response to it. I thought that was a good start, but then as you get deeper into the game and the city still looks the same and the people still look the same and they're still acting the same way, and then your companions forgive you even though you screwed over their home cities, that's where, again, that lack of consequence started to fade in more and more. The biggest problem this game encounters, though, as you can likely tell, is something that also happened to Avowed, so we'll use the same terminology there. It's laying down the tracks while the train is still moving here. Pre-production is extremely important because once you start laying down the code and that code becomes rigid, we'll say, it's not built with like pop sticks and bubble gum where you can kind of try to maneuver and manipulate a little bit without rebuilding the entire system, which obviously takes a ton of time. When you start to solidify these decisions, be like, okay, we're going in this direction. And why are they making these decisions? Because they thought they had a year, but then as they go on more and more, they actually probably could have undone some of these choices or not put them down as rigidly if they knew they would have ended up having more time. So that is the problem with developing games in this environment. You'll hear heroic tales. I think Halo 2 is a great example of like how laying down the train tracks and just making those great decisions after great decisions. It is a horrible development environment, but you just get a goated game out of it. Sometimes it just cooks like that, but most times, as we learn with these extended development environments, it doesn't work. And as we'll continue to read here, this is just 2022. Let's get into 2023, where I think really the wheels come off because I did not know this about the BioWare teams and how there's a little bit of division between Dragon Age and the Mass Effect team. And I think in one place it kind of publicly showed that I'll point out, but let's read. In 2023, to help finish Dragon Age, BioWare brought in a second internal team, which was working for the next Mass Effect game. For decades, there had been tension between the two well-established camps known for their starkly divergent ways of doing things. BioWare developers like to joke that the Dragon Age crew was like a pirate ship meandering and sometimes traveling off course, but eventually reaching the port. In contrast, the Mass Effect group was called the USS Enterprise after the Star Trek ship because commands were issued straight down from the top and executed zealously. As the Mass Effect directors took control, they scoffed that the Dragon Age squad had been doing a shoddy job and began excluding their leaders from pivotal meetings, according to people familiar with the internal friction. Over time, the Mass Effect team went on to overhaul parts of the game and design a number of additional scenes, including a rich emotional finale that players loved. But even changes that appeared to improve the game stoked the simmering rancor inside BioWare, infuriating Dragon Age leaders who had been told they didn't have the budget for such big, ambitious swings. It always seemed that when the Mass Effect team made its demands in meetings with EA regarding the resources it needed, it got its way. David Gator, a former lead writer on the Dragon Age franchise who left before the development of the new game started, but Dragon Age always had to fight against headwinds. I found this very interesting, and I started to think and speculate a bit. How do you get to this point? Why does the Mass Effect team seem to earn a little bit of that respect from EA and that trust from EA, whereas Dragon Age does not? I think it goes down to two things. I think one is the core series identity. Dragon Age has never had a consistent one as far as I'm concerned. Every single entry is so wildly different from the last one. Like when you saw Origins, if they just kept doing more of that, I don't think we'd be here right now. But also at the same time, the best-selling entry in the franchise was Inquisition, which tried to mix together elements of 1 and 2. And so I thought that was more of what we were going to get. So I think that inconsistent DNA, we don't know how they got to that point, but I think EA leaders could maybe mark that down as they don't know what they want to do. And as described by BioWare themselves, according to this article, they kind of wander off course sometimes, and that's shown in the products. Not trying to full blame them, but I'm just saying, if I'm thinking about this from the outside looking in, that's one thing I look at and go, Mass Effect 1, 2, 3, and hell, even Andromeda has consistently been a thing. Dragon Age, for better or for worse, depending on what kind of fan you are, has never been specifically a thing. The other thing is money. I think Mass Effect is money, and Dragon Age is not always guaranteed money, and this is a business where the Mass Effect people know how to make money, is maybe how EA looks at things. Also, what I've heard, and as someone who's been in that pitch environment before, there is a way to talk money to these people where they don't care about the creative vision. Like, for example, as me, like a deep storyteller, I care about that stuff. It's really hard to convey that to people who are looking at the dollars and cents and being like, okay, well, how's your giving to make us money? Maybe the Mass Effect team is just really good at that, where the BioWare team tries to talk with their feelings too much. That is an unfortunate reality that I've learned with this industry. Anyway, just my guess on the matter here, but it continues on because the infighting grows a little bit. Early testers and Mass Effect leads complained about the game's snarky tone, a style of video game storytelling once ascendant that was quickly falling out of fashion in pop culture, but had been part of Goldman's vision for the multiplayer game. So again, this goes back to the multiplayer game. Worried that Dragon Age could face the same outcome as Forspoken, a recent title that had been hammered over its impertinent banter, BioWare leaders ordered a belated rewrite of the game's dialogue to make it sound more serious, and in the end, it resulted in tonal inconsistencies. A mass layoff at BioWare and a mandate to work overtime depleted morale, while a voice actor strike limited the writer's ability to revise the dialogue and create new scenes. An initial trailer made the next Dragon Age seem more like Fortnite than a dark fantasy role-playing game, triggering concerns that EA just didn't know how to market the game. Again, this is where I kind of go 50-50 on it just a little bit, which I know is not probably what people who are like pro BioWare want to hear, but when the game has changed tones this many times and it's like both snarky, but also, I mean, look, the proof is in the pudding. That tone is crazy in Veilguard, and I went in on as much in my review. But I think in a lot of ways, it kind of framed the game on exactly what it would be. It really wasn't as dark as we had hoped it would be, even though that first shot of like Minrathous and the way it was depicted, I was like, okay, this feels like what I'd want out of an evolved version of Inquisition. What I find perhaps the most staggering out of everything we've read thus far is not the infighting, but that what we played was a rewrite with knowledge that the tone was off. This goes into voice acting and how it's a double-edged sword, because when you record a set of lines, what people don't think about when they're playing a game is not someone wrote like, you know, their dialogue lines in, say, like Google Docs or something like that. They send them on over, like, these are your lines, read them, you're done, right? It's like, well, when you want to change something, if the whole game's voice and all of a sudden like the voice line disappears for another entry in the dialogue lines. Like, you can't just change it on the fly. That's why some games don't mess with voice acting sometimes at all until like a re-release or something along those lines, because then you know what the script is actually going to be and it's not going to dramatically shift. But what happens is, I almost think about it like ink, right? There are things that you do in game development, like we've talked about throughout this video, that are kind of done in pencil, and you can take the eraser and you can scrub it away. When you start to get into voice acting, you're kind of putting ink on the writing now, because it's going to cost more to undo it. And that's why you get some fucking wild scenes in Dragon Age the Veilguard versus ones that I think were a little more acceptable. If I were to draw you comparisons of like what I thought was a great scene in Veilguard versus what I thought was a really bad scene, I think of the scene where you talk with Mathal, you talk with Morgan. This is toward the end of the game, but my God, I was like, this is what I was here for. This was really good. It was like 5 minutes I was just holding on to my controller, just completely lost in the conversation. I was like, yes. This, like, it was that sour feeling, because at that point I was like 70 hours deep. I was like, man, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, but it was really good. And then there's moments like pulling a barf where you're like, what is going on here? Like, and that tonal inconsistency, I think, does stem from, as I talked about earlier in my review, and I'll talk about here, bad creative decision making. You still made the choice to make that the scene. That still falls to BioWare, no matter how they want to do it. And I get if it was originally written and then, hey, we want to rewrite it, but like, we couldn't because voice acting was there. And so, but that's why content's a thing. You just bye. And I know it sucks to let go of, but again, it comes down to creative decision making. And if there's one thing I can point to where I saw the Mass Effect team kind of step outside about Veilguard, it was within the 48-hour window of the launch of Veilguard, to my memory. But Mike Gamble, who's the current director of the next Mass Effect game of this new skeleton crew at BioWare, as many of the layoffs have already hit the company and much of the Dragon Age team is out, Mike Gamble wrote, regarding tone questions, Mass Effect will maintain the mature tone of the original trilogy. This is all I'm going to say for now. I'm not sure I agree with the Pixar thing, but Mass Effect is photorealistic and will be as long as I'm running it. This was an immediate scramble, as I read, and I think Mike's a good dude, but it was an immediate scramble based on the reaction to Veilguard at launch, which was like, don't panic, we're not doing that. And when you look at the one good part of Veilguard that most of us who played the game, by the way, agreed upon, it was the finale, which was what the Mass Effect team did, and it fits because that was a Mass Effect-ass finale. BioWare themselves had admitted that this was a Mass Effect 2 inspired finale, and it was really good, and you felt the consequences of your choices. Like, it was, again, good stuff, but knowing it's from the Mass Effect team, you could look at it as like, oh, that builds confidence, because they came in and they did that, and that was good based on what was all in the front part of the game. I do find it a little concerning that, like, the Dragon Age team literally didn't build their own finale to a game that they've been making for so long. Does that add credibility to, based on how EA looks at things? It's up to you, really, at the end of the day. We still don't know enough to really weigh that sort of decision making. But to be clear, I'm not framing it like Mike threw Dragon Age under the bus, but there was an immediate recognition or knowledge of like, hey, this is a one-time thing, baby. Don't you worry about it. It's not happened with Mass Effect. And so, obviously, the verdict is still out on that, but we'll see. Everyone's got to be guarded with BioWare at this point now, because I don't think there is any hope for hype until we see something that truly looks good. The question is if we even get to that point, especially because now we're seeing a lot of Mass Effect competitors pop up. The Expanse looks really cool, and that's coming from Owlcat, who's an amazing RPG developer. And then you have Exodus, who's coming from like the people who made Knights of the Old Republic, like former BioWare people. So Mass Effect needs to be on its A game, and some of that thunder is definitely going to be stolen if these games are good, because they're no doubt, maybe outside of the Expanse, coming out much sooner than the next Mass Effect will, especially given how small this team is. But let's wrap up this article. They write, following the layoffs and staff reassignments at BioWare earlier in the year, a small team of a few dozen employees is now working on the next Mass Effect. After 3 high-profile failures in a row, questions linger about EA's commitment to the studio. In May, the company relabeled its Edmonton headquarters from a BioWare office to a hub for all EA staff in the area. Historically, BioWare has never been an important studio at EA, which generates more than $7 billion in annual revenue, largely from its sports games and shooters. Depending on the timing of its launches, BioWare typically accounts for just 5% of EA's annual bookings, according to estimates by Colin Sebastian, an analyst with Robert W. Baird & Co. Even so, there may be strategic reason for EA to keep supporting BioWare. Single-player role-playing games are expensive to make, but can lead to huge windfalls when successful, as seen with Cyberpunk, Elden Ring, and Baldur's Gate 3. In order to grow, EA needs to do more than just sports franchises, said TD Cowen analyst Doug Kreutz. trying to fix its fantasy-focused studio may be easier than starting something new. And real quick, I just want to pivot. If you want to look at a great example of that, just look at Xbox and the Initiative, right? This all-star team built from the ground up, like industry-wide talent that's crazy. And we saw how it fell apart. Like most of that studio and its leadership left. It's pretty much like a Crystal Dynamics project. And don't get me wrong, by the way, I think from what we've seen of the gameplay, that game looks awesome. But you see how building from the ground up takes a lot of time, like even down to just company culture. Like what is the way we make games? Like that is a big part of the process. So I get why they'd want to just fix BioWare rather than start something new. But as many of us have documented before, much of what makes BioWare, those people are gone, especially after Veilguard. So wrapping it up, it says, that said, if they shutter the doors tomorrow, I wouldn't be totally surprised. Kreutz added, it has been over a decade since they produced a hit, end quote. And the article ends there. Quite the piece here. Quite a lot to dig into, as you see. And yeah, there's no doubt there's a few things that we can at least say with a guarantee. And we knew one of these already, which is this is BioWare's last chance. There's been a lot of those moments like, do they keep going after Andromeda? Come on, it's just one bump in the road. Okay. Do they keep going after something like Anthem? No, get back to your single player roots. It'll all be fine then. So they get the extended development environment. They get the time they need, but all of the systems are down and in ink, and they can't undo bad decisions that they made throughout the course of the development. Well, bad decisions, but also decisions that they made very quickly, thinking they had less time than they actually did. So in turn, they're kind of in this spot now where it's go big or go home. And I don't think there's any more room for forgiveness, unfortunately, for them. And yeah, Mass Effect needs to be masterful. Like it needs to be a return to that feeling that Mass Effect 1 and 2 and 3 gave us truly. And BioWare needs to stay lean. That's the other reality. I don't think they invest heavily in BioWare even after a hit. I think it's like, we know what happens when you get too big and you're managing too many things. It gets chaotic. So the decision-making needs to be like borderline perfect the whole way through. And that's tough to do. So we'll see how BioWare stacks up. Again, the competition's mounting around Mass Effect now. So it's not even like they have this advantage of, hey, we're doing something in the market that no one else is doing. There's a lot of Mass Effect likes on the way. So we'll see, but that's what's going on with Veilguard, and I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Fire away. Other than that, take excellent care of yourselves, and I'll catch you in the next one. Stay sexy, stay active. I love you all. Peace.